welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowdon Deli restaurant. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Bill Brownstein, Leslie Chesterman, and our special guest today, former MP Marc Garneau. Thank you so much for being here.
Delighted to be with you.
I know everyone has questions, so I will kick it off, and then we'll kind of pick it up from there. We had a chance to speak a few weeks ago, and my first question at the time was, you've had this planned for a while. When I say this, your retirement, it seemed to catch everybody by surprise. Why now?
Well, because I made a promise to my family that last fall that I would retire after tabling a report on medical assistance in dying, I was on a committee that chaired it, and that was my promise to my family, and I've kept my promise.
And the thing that came up as soon as you said that was, wait, we need you to do something else. We need you to run somewhere else. Everyone, and I think to a person, when we took phone calls after our interview, I like Marc Garneau. I respect Marc Garneau. Tremendous admiration for what you've accomplished in your political career, but you make it very clear that you're no longer interested in any capacity of getting involved in politics.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a good run at it. I started 17 years ago. I lost the first time in Vaudreuil-sur-Lange, and then 14 years ago was elected in Westmount-Ville-Marie at the time. I've had a good run. I've had 7 years in opposition. I had 6 years as a minister. I had 2 very important committees that I finished off with, and it's now time to focus on my family.
Okay, I will point out one thing. We discussed this amongst ourselves. So Westmount was your riding. This is your first ever visit to the Snowdon Deli.
Yes, indeed. And, I've heard of the Snowdon Deli, but...
You flew over it.
I flew over it, yes. And I have been in Montreal for 20 years, so I have no excuse for not coming. So I'm really glad you guys invited me here today.
And you will be taking home smoked meat, we understand, by the time this is over.
Yes, I mean, as soon as I opened the door, I said, smoked meat, I got to get it.
Now, Bill, I know you want to talk about something that's very much in the news right now, and that's what's going on with China.
Yeah, well, very interesting because Marc was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, federally speaking, and during your time as the minister, you were fighting very feverishly to get the 2 Michaels back from China. Mm-hmm. And we now hear in the news that a certain member of Parliament from Ontario, Don Hong, allegedly spoke to the Chinese about perhaps, this is before the 21 election, about perhaps keeping them a little longer because it would help the Conservatives if they were released sooner. That must have made your blood boil.
Well, it certainly caught me completely by surprise. It's something I'd never heard of. Of course, yes, you're right. We were focusing on getting the 2 Michaels back. These are allegations. He's denied them vehemently. I don't understand the logic of the statement that this would help the Conservatives. It would have helped the Liberals if we could get them back as quickly as possible. He's I think, thinking of launching a defamation suit against Global. So he is obviously denying this. I sure hope nobody was saying that kind of thing at a time when we were really trying very, very hard to get the 2 Michaels back.
The Corner Booth Podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowdon Deli, serving Montrealers since 1946 and home of the city's best smoked meat sandwich, the Snowdon Deli, DeCarry Boulevard, north of Queen Mary Road.
That said, it's got to be very disheartening for you to see the state of affairs between Canada and China at this point in time. I mean, they've deteriorated to a level like we haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah, there's no question about it. The allegations, and there seems to be solid evidence for it, that China has been interfering with not only federal elections, but possibly also provincial and municipal elections. I'm talking about Vancouver here. That goes to the heart of our democracy, and we need to look into that urgently. I personally favor a public inquiry being called as soon as possible, because this is something that Canadians are very disturbed about, the fact that somebody may try to influence the course of the country.
So my question is, this story is in the news now, in the last couple of months, the idea of a public inquiry. Then we understand China's been doing this kind of a thing, not surprisingly, around the world. It's not unique to Canada. While you were Foreign Relations Minister, had this ever come up, Chinese interference, alleged Chinese interference, ever? Had you ever heard about it?
Not with respect to elections. I was never, ever told anything about that. However, China does have a presence in Canada where it tries to create links with certain Canadians to create a favorable image for China. They have, of course, been doing research in our universities, and that is now being cut back because of the concern about intellectual property. They have been interested in buying certain companies in Canada because, in some cases, because of potential strategic interests or intellectual property. That I was aware of, and we were taking measures with respect to that. But with respect to elections, that caught me by surprise.
With respect to what's going on in the rest of the world, too, Russia, Ukraine, all the rest, these were issues when you started off. You haven't been the foreign affairs minister since the last election, essentially. But again, another level that madness that is going on in the world. How do you react? What do you see as the future here?
Well, absolutely. With respect to Russia and their unprovoked, totally unacceptable invasion of Ukraine. I met with Sergei Lavrov, who is their Minister of Foreign Affairs, when I went to Iceland for the Arctic Council in 2021. And I rebuked him with respect to the 2014 invasion, taking over Crimea, creating all sorts of problems in the in the Donbass region of Ukraine. There's absolutely no question what Russia is doing is totally unacceptable, and I think Canada's response in terms of coming to the help of Ukraine, along with many other nations, has been the right response, and we must absolutely continue to do this until Russia in some way is forced to back down and to leave. There's no question about it. This is a very existential challenge for the planet, and we have to stick to our guns.
I'm wondering, too, just to get back to China for a second, one of the issues that's been discussed beyond the public inquiry is this idea for a need for a foreign actors list. In other words, knowing the people from the Chinese government, any other government, knowing who they are, something that countries like the U.S. already have. We've not yet done this here. It doesn't seem like there's yet much of an appetite for it. Why do you think that is?
I personally support that. I know that the United States has done it. I know Australia has done it. I think in the times we're living in at the moment, I think that this is something that is warranted. The government says it's studying it. We'll see what happens.
When you say the government, I keep reminding myself that you were part of that government up until not that long ago. You talked about your family making a promise to them that you would get away from politics. How much, if any, anything in your decision was affected by what was going on within your government? Things you didn't like. I know about Bill C-13. We're going to talk about that as well. Were you starting to sour on politics in general, or on being a member of a party that perhaps wasn't acting the way you thought it should act at that time?
No. I will say that I was disappointed not to be to continue as Foreign Affairs Minister. That was a disappointment to me, but I'd been elected 3 weeks before. I was hardly going to say, okay, I'm going home. I'm not carrying on. It wouldn't have been right. So I took on some jobs that turned out to be very, very satisfying. But in the meantime, and I think I said this on your program, I still had to be the MP for NDG Westmount, and I had to continue doing my job. And C-13, for example, came up, and I had some disagreement. I have some disagreement with the government, and I spoke up about it. So I continued to do my job. But no, nothing to do with souring on anything. I believe as a member of the Liberal Party, the government, that it's my job to try to do my job and to try to, of course, continue to hopefully, as a government, govern wisely. And so that had nothing to do with it.
If I can go back, you mentioned to me as well, and I think it'll be interesting for people watching this, to talk about your background. You're an engineer by trade, of course, Canada's most famous astronaut at the time.
First astronaut.
I don't know if you're going to have a fight with Chris Hadfield over who the most famous one is, but how does someone go from being an engineer, then an astronaut, and then end up in federal politics? Was that something you could have possibly planned?
No, absolutely not. I mean, my first love in life was to join the Navy, and that's what I did. It just so happened that in 1983, Canada had the opportunity to create an astronaut program, and this was because NASA wanted to fly some Canadians because we had provided the Canadarm to the shuttle. We had designed it and built it, and it worked perfectly the entire 30 years it was used. So they wanted to thank us, and so I saw an ad and circumstances, total serendipity. I said, oh, that would be great. I'll try for that, and that brought me into there. Now, from there to politics is a little bit more of a stretch, but I got interested in politics early in life. I followed what was going on in the world. And when I was the president of the Canadian Space Agency, I reported to a minister, the Minister of Industry, Science and Technology. And I'd see him once a week, and I made me realize that that they're the ones who make the decisions. And I thought, maybe if I run for politics, I'll have a chance one day to make some of those decisions. And that's how I decided to get into it.
And did someone try to dissuade you from getting into it?
No, nobody did. I was, and at the time I was 57. It was kind of late to get into politics, but I was approached by two people from Paul Martin's government, and they said, "We'd like you to run." Well, first of all, are you a liberal? And I said, "Yes, I'm a liberal." Okay. So you're okay there. And then they said, "We're probably going to have an election in either in a month or in 3 months, and we'd like you to run." Now, of course, my timing was not very good because the sponsorship scandal was all over the place. Liberals had been in power for, if you take Chrétien and Martin, for 13 years, and I think that Canadians wanted to change for sure. And when I ran in Vaudreuil-Soulanges, I learned that that was in fact the case.
It's interesting, though. You lose an election from someone who's never been in politics before, and then you'd think perhaps that would sour you on running again. What made you stay in the game?
So that was a very tough period. It's not fun losing an election. The night that I lost in January 2006 was a tough night for me. And I said, was it really worthwhile putting all that into it? Because I worked very hard on that campaign. Took a lot of abuse. Suddenly from being a popular person. And many people said this to me. We liked you when you were an astronaut, but we don't like you now because of your policies. And Canadians are indeed entitled to tell you what they think about politics, hopefully politely. It wasn't always polite. But I decided, I lost. I don't like to lose. I'm not going to just give up. I'll stick around. And I got involved with policy and other things, science and technology mostly, and I decided to stick with it. And then Lucienne Robillard said she was retiring, and I happened to live in Westmount, so I put my name forward. Initially, Stéphane Dion, who was our leader, wasn't overly enthusiastic about it, but then he changed his mind.
Why not?
I don't know. But then he said, Mark, come and meet me at Stormont, the official residence of the official leader of the opposition. We had dinner, and after that he said, I'd like you to run.
The Corner Booth Podcast is brought to you in part by Guaranteed Industries. In business since 1957, taking care of all your heating and air conditioning needs. And remember, they're a Lennox Premier dealer. Guaranteed Industries online at guaranteedindustries.com or call 514-342-3400.
Two careers, which was the more challenging? Of those two careers of yours, yes.
Well, they're pretty close in very different ways, but politics is, in some ways, for a person like me, was more challenging because, and I've said this a million times, when you're an astronaut, you're dealing with the laws of physics, and that's straightforward. If you know those laws, you can do your job. Politics is a far more complex business. It's wrapped up in emotions. It's wrapped up in values. It's much more difficult from that point of view. So I have always tended to take rather an engineering approach to politics. I'm like Mr. Spock. I like logic, although I do allow some emotion to come into it. But that's the way I think, and for some people, being an engineer and having that Cartesian approach to things is probably viewed as a disadvantage. But it worked well for me.
It was very interesting because there's a bit of a backstory. When we talked a few weeks back, I asked you if perhaps the reason why you weren't reappointed to Foreign Affairs had to do with a personal issue with Justin Trudeau, because as some people will recall, you had at one point challenged him for the leadership of the party, and you said, as you told me, and you've talked about, is that you felt that you didn't have a chance, so you backed off. And you said then when you found out that you were upset to find out that you weren't being reappointed to Foreign Affairs, but then when you did find out? You said you would have retired prior to this had you known, because you wanted to continue with that mandate because you'd only been doing it for a short period. So I wondered, like a lot of people speculated, perhaps that was related to the quick announcement of retirement, but we know otherwise.
No, and you're right. If the Prime Minister had come to me, let's say that summer, or early enough to have a by-election or to have a new candidate step forward, I would not have run in the 2021 election because if I'd known that I was not going back to Foreign Affairs. Because my reason for staying on, because I told my family I would actually retire in 2021 before the next election. The reason that I decided to stay on is because he suddenly put me into Foreign Affairs when I had been in transport and was happy to finish my career in transport. But when he put me in Foreign Affairs, I said 7 months is really not enough time. I've got so many things I want to do. But if he had told me, Mark, your time is up, I would not have run in the 2021 election to win and be a backbencher.
I would ask you, you brought up being transport minister. I think people forget you've had a fairly lengthy career. That's been one of the more difficult files in this government, especially now. We all know what's going on. I actually feel bad sometimes for Omar Al-Gabra trying to explain why things have messed up the way they have. You were transport minister. Was it your choice to leave that portfolio? How did that happen? Why wouldn't you want to stay?
No. And first of all, transport is a very complicated portfolio. It's also an economic portfolio. It touches everyone, whether they travel by train, by plane, by road. It's a very big and complex portfolio, and there are always lots of issues. Safety ones, if a train crashes or a plane crashes, that comes to the fore. Also, people have strong feelings about their how well the air system works when they go to the airport to take a flight somewhere and they get delayed and what have you. And in fact, I brought in this passenger rights bill, or not bill, but sort of a charter of passenger rights. But it's been a work in progress. We didn't anticipate COVID, where the airlines said, we're not going to pay you your money back, we're going to give you credit for your next flight. Nobody had anticipated that kind of massive effect. Secondly, I also did ask the government for more funds for the Canadian Transportation Agency. I said, we're now, with this charter in place, we're going to get a lot more claims, and we have to have more people so we can respond more quickly. Unfortunately, I was not successful in getting more funding for it, and that's why there's a large backlog right now. So it's a work in progress, but ultimately, when it does land properly, I think that people will recognize that the charter is a good thing.
But to my question, did you want to stay in that portfolio?
I was happy to stay in it. In fact, he put me back in it after the 2019 election, and my thinking was, there'll probably be an election in 2 years. We're a minority government, and I will finish off in transport, and that'll be a nice way for me to finish off. I didn't expect to transfer to Foreign Affairs.
Okay.
I have a little question about transport. What are the chances here in Canada of ever seeing high-speed rail between the Toronto-Quebec City corridor?
I don't think we're going to see that for a very long
in
time.
Our lifetime?
Probably not. And the reason for it is it's a glamorous idea, but it costs so much more than what we're planning, which is high-frequency rail, which is more frequent trains that will go faster, by the way, because they'll be on dedicated lines. The problem with the current arrangement is that Via Rail is mostly on CN and CP lines, and they have to give right of way whenever there's a cargo train going by. Having your own dedicated lines will allow you to up that speed, and so there will be more reliable and more frequent service. But to go to high speed,
No TGV and
TGV, this is not a nice, mild country like Europe.
Right.
This is Canada. It's a rough place.
and the New York-Montreal corridor, there was talk of that too.
There's been talk about a lot of things, but sometimes it's a bit of a pipe dream.
Yeah, right.
Now, I guess we can move on. I know Bill we talked about this before you got here, to talk about the elephant in the room, as it were. Mm-hmm. Your decision, when we spoke, and I know Bill wrote about it in his column as well, you said, this is the hill I picked to die on. And we're talking about Bill C-13, the Official Languages Act. It's still contentious, and I imagine will be until such time as there is, in fact, a new law. But Bill, go ahead. I know you wanted to ask the question.
You talked about how much love you were getting when you were an astronaut, and then people said, you're not as nice anymore. And this is before all of this. You're getting an awful lot of flack now from from French media in Quebec, basically suggesting that it makes a lot of us wonder, when you're basically advocating for minority language rights everywhere in the country, for Francophones throughout the rest of the country, for Anglos here, why is this turned into you and Anthony Housefather and a few others who turned against your government, basically, at the time? Why is this such an issue?
Well, you're right. It certainly is a big issue, and particularly in Quebec, and particularly with the French media. No question about it. For the record, let me make it very clear. I want to protect French in Quebec. I want to protect French minorities in the rest of the country. But the bill, C-13, which is the Official Languages Act, and it's being modernized, this bill C-13, has as its mandate the protection of minority rights, language rights in the country. That has to be done consistently.
And you should state, by the way, that you are a Francophone.
I'm a Francophone. I'm a Francophone, and that's probably made it even harder in terms of being criticized even more. But the point that I want to bring up here is that the reaction in French media has been, if you are trying to protect linguistic rights of the minority in Quebec, you are automatically against protecting French rights in Quebec, which is not the case. But that is the gut reaction of my dear French brethren here in Quebec, and that's unfortunate. I'm trying to protect French, but I think you can also stand up for English linguistic rights and do both. Some people just don't think that the two are possible.
The Corner Booth Podcast is brought to you in part by Empire Gold, paying the most for gold and silver in all your collectibles. 5593 Paré at Devonshire. Empire Gold, where you get paid right on the spot. All the details online, empiregold.ca. How does this ultimately play out?
So at the moment, I think that Bill 96, which is really the charter, the Quebec Charter of French Language, replacing 101, which we'd all learn to live with, will, I think, be challenged in courts. So we'll see how that works out. With respect to C-13, which is a federal bill, it is currently in the legislative process. It goes into committee, the Language Committee, and it's reviewed clause by clause. Now, I'm not on that committee, but I noticed that there were 215 amendments proposed to it, 88 of them coming from the Bloc, some of which said because they have enshrined it, the Quebec Charter of the French Language is mentioned in two places in the federal bill, because it's in there, the Bloc thought, well, we'll also make some amendments to say if there's a conflict between the federal bill and the provincial charter will take precedence. Now, those have now been considered to be non-receivable, but they weren't initially when I made my statement in December, when they were part of the 88 changes that the Bloc wanted to make. When that whole process of clause-by-clause review of Bill C-13 ends, it comes back into the House at what's called report stage, and then there will be a vote, and we'll see what happens. It will have been modified by some of the amendments that have been put forward by the Conservatives, by the Liberals, by the Bloc, and by the NDP, and we'll see how each of the party reacts to it.
I almost get the impression that this government would like to see that bill delayed as long as it possibly can be, because it is so contentious, at least here in Quebec, and drag it out and hope it just kind of goes away at some point.
My sense is that the government wants to deal with it at this point, and whatever happens will happen. That's my sense at this point. And certainly the other parties are in a hurry to get it passed.
How disappointing was it for you to be that lone wolf? And I say that meaning Anthony Housefather, I know, has spoken up about this as well. But to have to take a position, as Bill kind of brought up, where you're basically criticizing your own government because you're trying to do the right thing.
Not easy. I've often said to people that when you enter political life, you will have to make decisions every time you vote. And it'll be on public record. You'll stand up and you'll say you're either yay or nay. In the vast majority of cases, I've never had a problem voting with my government because I agree with them. In a few cases, I've not felt so strongly about supporting the government, but it wasn't, as I've said, a hill to die on. Once in a while, there will be circumstances where you feel that you must stand up and speak. And I believe I'm a principled person. And in this particular case, having a reference in a federal bill to a provincial language charter was not acceptable to me, because it gave it a presence in a federal bill where if there were disputes about interpretation, that it had a greater legitimacy now than it should have.
I have a question because, sorry, I'm going outside of that topic now, but as somebody who's retiring, a politician who's retiring, do you see young people going into politics anymore? Because there's so many, is it just going to be a bunch of young, ambitious lawyers who are going to go into politics? Who is going into politics? Who's the next generation of politicians?
Well, I'd like to think that young people are still interested in trying to become politicians to shape the country. I'd like to think that. I think there's value in having middle-aged people, such as myself, enter politics with a little bit of background experience as well. So I will say I'm very interested in watching what's going to unfold here in NDG Westmount, who's going to come to the fore and present themselves. There could be some young people, we'll see, but I hope that there's an enthusiasm for Canadians to continue being in politics. It's easier to sell politics when everything is going well. It's a little harder to sell it when times are tough. And I think we're going through challenging times now.
Have you heard some names? You mentioned NDG Westmount, who someone is going to run to take over for you. Have you heard any names being mentioned?
I've heard some rumors of people, yes, being interested and sort of testing the waters and checking things out. I won't mention them because if they choose not to, I shouldn't have put them on the spot. But yes, there seems to be some movement happening.
There is interest.
There's interest because nobody knows when the by-election will happen, but it could conceivably, depending on if you put it on an accelerated track, and there's 4 other by-elections in the country as well, so there's 5 in all. It could happen in June if you really fast-tracked it. Otherwise, it will happen in the fall, but people don't know yet, so they may be trying to already test the waters.
So we have to wrap up. I will ask you one last question, kind of a general question. Most surprising and most disappointing things that you learned in politics?
Well, I think that sometimes we don't act quickly enough when we have all the facts in front of us and we have to make a decision. And it's usually when the decision is not an easy decision. But it's not because we don't have the facts in front of us. And that is one of the things that you have to do in politics, is you have to make difficult decisions sometimes and not drag it out because you really don't want to make the decision. If you haven't got all the facts, that's another matter. But if it's really in front of you, you should face it. That's part of the job of being a politician. You shouldn't be in politics to try to stay in power. You should be a politician because you want to do what is right for the country, or at least what you think is right for the country.
Okay.
Marc, when we spoke, you talked about you're working on your memoirs, and one of the things you disclosed was the fact that your younger days were actually rather rebellious, and people might be shocked. And you yourself pointed out that you were amazed you even made it to adulthood. And I remember after having written that, people were stunned. They always thought you were the most ramrod straight individual on the face of the planet.
You must have a very proud mother. Your mother must have...
But in any event, we're going to learn all about that in the memoirs.
Yes, I hope that I will be able to publish them. And yes, I have a proud mother who's no longer with us, but also an amazed mother as well, that I did make it through some silly moments in my youth. And but that's, I think, because youth straightened me out, because I made all these mistakes.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning, Marc Garneau. Appreciate it. All the best to you. And looking forward, that memoir not that far away, you said, right?
Not that far away. We'll see if there's interest. But thank you, Aaron.
All right, thank you.
It will be. Thank you, Marc.
Leslie and Bill.
That takes care of this edition of the Corner Booth Podcast. Thank you for watching.